Good afternoon, friends. Thank you so much for being at our lecture today. This is a lecture for Ezra, Nehemiah, and Ezekiel. Unfortunately, we won't get a chance to spend too much time with Ezekiel, but definitely with Ezra and Nehemiah. I want to start with this Aesop fable because I think it's super important to understanding what it is that we're talking about today. And so it begins this way. It's Aesop's fables, the lion and the statue. A man and a lion were discussing the relative strength of men and lions in general. The man contended that he and his fellows were stronger than lions by reason of their greater intelligence. Come now with me, he cried, and I will prove that I am right. So he took him into the public gardens and showed him a statue of Hercules overcoming the lion and tearing his mouth into two. That is all very well, said the lion, but proves nothing, for it was a man who made the statue. And so I bring that fable up only to help us as an illustration to further understanding what we're discussing, what we're trying to understand when it comes to the historical perspectives and writings of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah were people of their time, if you will, and so they had been in exile and they were being invited, or they're being given the opportunity, I'm not invited, but the opportunity to move to back to Jerusalem, back to Israel, back to their homeland, if you will. And so the background to that is somewhat important because I feel like it begs us to take into personal consideration our own lives. This narrative and all of these narratives speak to us as individuals. They speak to who we are and what we're about. And I think that we have to look at that through this lens. I spoke about this, and I think very much our last conversation before midterms, where I talked to you about the biblical students who were in that Near Eastern European group, and they were from folks that had been exiled, and they thought about how the newspaper was written, and the conversation I hope you can remember was about who wrote the article. Who is the article written to, and what are we supposed to get from it? Because that means so much to our understanding of the Bible, and it means so much to our understanding of everything. So any article that we read, you have to have that lens. You have to have some way to filter what you're seeing, what you're reading, and what you're hearing, in trying to understand the totality of the message. So if someone's telling you something, or you read something, or it's being reported to you in some way, you have to take into consideration to truly understand it. That kind of filter, like, who is telling me this? Is this a leader of a country? Is this a reporter? If it's a reporter, what organization do they represent? Clearly, we know in the 21st century that different news outlets have different shadings to them, shadings of liberalism, shadings of conservatism, as well as when they come away from the mainstream and they become non-mainstream. We have to question, what is the political intent of a mainstream or a non-mainstream media outlet? Is the validity of a story that comes from a podcaster or an individual video maker, YouTube maker, is the quality of the research, is the quality of the questions, is the understanding there, or is it more opinion? Because sometimes people can certainly take components or pieces of facts and pull them together and then try to develop what they consider the quote unquote truth. And quite honestly, putting a lot of facts together doesn't always deliver you the truth. As a matter of fact, putting a bunch of facts together can very much give you the opposite of the truth. Because I could tell you something and you could interpret it one way. These are the words, but I've interpreted this way. And somebody else can hear the exact same story, listen to me verbatim, and get the same perspective. We talk about this, and we'll talk about this in the next couple of weeks. When we look at the Gospels, and the Gospels are all four stories that illustrate the ministry of Jesus during in the first century, and they're all different perspectives. They're all in different orders. They all tell just a little bit different piece to something. And I think it's important to understand that they tell all these different pieces, because what it says to me as a reader is that every one of those stories, the person who does the storytelling has a different perspective. They're trying to tell us something different within the same confines of lines, stories, and narrative. And so we have to have that as a really integral part of what we're thinking when we're reading. So I want you to keep that in your mind, because many of you, I would imagine, are home right now, and so it's not the first time that you're returning home. I would imagine at some level. Even if you're a freshman, you've had to go home. And even if, for example, when you get to high school, then you've gone back and kind of visited your middle school or something. I want you to take that in that same perspective. Like, have you ever moved away or left a location and returned, and things are very different? You return to your parents' house, or you go to see a relative, and the carpet's changed, and or the furniture's changed. Now the rules are different. No one's allowed in that room because that's new carpet. We don't want you to walk on that. Or you've gone back to your middle school, or you've gone back to your elementary school, and the principal who you had was so loved and so respected and treated you is no longer there, and so maybe the rules are different. So you may have been able to walk into that school and visit your second grade teacher whenever you wanted, and the old principal thought that was wonderful, and the new principal absolutely doesn't allow it. And so that change, there's that gap in time where things change, creates a different a model, a different dynamic for each of us to live and to have an experience with when we come to returning. And so these two stories really have that in mind. They are considered, Ehrman describes how they're considered in the historical piece, right? The Ketuvim of Hebrew scripture, the historical piece. And Ezekiel kind of falls into the prophetic piece. So we're going to be focusing just on Ezra and just on Nehemiah today. But so when they tell these historical stories, we have to keep in mind who's writing them and what they're trying to change about what's going on in that world, and what are the big meaningful pieces to this that we need to be looking at and considering and deciding. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about Jonah's behavior. We talk about different prophets' behaviors. How are they different, and how are they unique, and how are they special? So Ezra and Nehemiah reflect the historical writing about the return from exile of the Judean people, the Jewish people. We talked about the word Jewish meaning holy remnant. So they've been kind of spread out all over the place through exile. And this is the exile that comes at the hands of the Babylonian capturing of Jerusalem and of the destruction of the Israelite military. And so the reaction to that is the Babylonians believe the best thing to do is to scoop up a bunch of the Israelites and the Hebrews and take them into exile with them. And so a piece of that, taking that with them, is that they take their best and brightest. They're going to take their scholars and their mathematicians, their scholars, their artists, all artisans, all kinds of folks that they think they can get something out of. And at that time, they're going to also try to convert them into a Babylonian style of people. Whether you know that or not, you take on the cultures of where you go. There are certain things that are the cultures here at Centenary University that are different from the cultures at Montclair State University, at William Patterson, at Pace. So every one of these places has a different culture to it. So when you go there, you learn pieces of that culture, and they become a part of you. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. So there were generations of families that moved into exile. So therefore, they had children that never lived in Jerusalem. Ezra and Nehemiah had not lived in Jerusalem before. They were coming there as first time folks, and I think it's important to understand that because the historical perspective almost leans into the idea that they know how it's always been, and they know how it's always been, and God is telling them to return it to that former glory. And so finally, the Babylonians are defeated by the Persians, and the Persians do not feel that the best way to deal with those places that they have conquered is to send people or take people into exile. The Persians think quite the opposite. They said, let these communities, let these cities, let these nations have their best people, and then we'll tax it out of them. So in other words, let them be in their homes, let them do all that they can do, grow, prosper, develop their nations, their farms, their art, their sciences, their literature, and then let's take from that. Let's tax them. So it kind of gives them a subversive, if you will, sense of submitting. And so that is exactly what they do. And so the steps in the process is that now Ezra and Nehemiah get sent back. And so Ezra goes back. And so Ezra lives under Babylonian rule and then under Persian rule. And in that rule, they are trying to keep the tightest, the most sincere, authentic rules of the Torah. And we kind of know that the Torah is written in exile. It's written after exile. So very much so, this handed down tradition that they're following is really kind of getting made up in direct lineage to the Babylonian rule. So this authentic, this clean, this pristine Torah that they're talking about really is already muddied with these other places. But if you read the Bible, if you're reading Ezra and you're reading Nehemiah without any kind of background, without any kind of critical eye to what they're doing, we say, well, hey, that's how everyone's supposed to live, and that's how they lived in the old days, and we're going to go back to that now. When it really is, we really need to challenge that narrative, that literature needs to be challenged, and so too in the 21st century. And we'll get back to that later on in this lecture. So let's get back to let's look at Ezra. So Ezra gets sent to Jerusalem. And so Ezra and Nehemiah return to Jerusalem, and I think it's important to know that they are invited. They are given the authority by the leadership of the Persian Empire, the king of Persia, to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, to rebuild their faith communities, to rebuild the Israelites, to rebuild all of theirs. So there's a physical rebuilding. Rebuild the temple, rebuild the walls, rebuild the community, redo the farms and stuff like that. There is a cognitive or a mental rebuilding, that we're going to be in this hierarchy that is not an exile hierarchy, but a long distance relationship of authority via edict from a different location, and a spiritual authority too. So they want to renew and restore the traditional Torah readings, their traditional Torah rules and regulations, laws, and spiritual practices. So it is a cultural restoration that Ezra and Nehemiah are called to do. And so Ezra goes there, and he is focused on the culture and on the spirituality and on the religion of this. And so the aspects are that, he's going to get everyone to follow the Torah, and he's going to get everyone to believe that, this is what is given to you from generation to generation. And so you need to hold on to this with great love and great respect and great understanding. And so that is their ultimate goal, to return Israel to its glory days. The before exile kind of time. And so, but it is set by the Persian kings and queens. So Ezra returns, and he sees what he considers the muddying of the purity of the Israelite people. And he sees that muddying. He sees it as the Israelites have intermarried with the other people. So the Babylonians all moved in. They moved into the empty spaces. They took over the homes. They took over this. They took over that. And then with the Babylonians, everybody else who the Babylonians had conquered also then now start to infiltrate all different parts and pieces and places within Israel, within Judah, within Jerusalem. So there's intermarriage, and Ezra's thoroughly upset about this, and he feels like that purity has to be changed. And so he comes out with an edict that every Israelite man must divorce his non-Israelite wife so that they only have pure blood, pure relationships, pure marriages. And so in the Bible, there's not a lot of pushback, not as much pushback as you could imagine, but certainly the people have to be there thinking, well, what is the purity behind this? There's an article that from Dana Nolan Fuel, who talks about the children of Israel reading the Bible for the sake of our children. And so she kind of takes it from a fictitious component where there is like this conflict that people are being forced to change, or they're going to lose everything to the new leadership of Persia, and that Ezra is saying that the God told him to do this. And there's this conflict because Fuel points out the regularity that you don't corner the truth. Just because the Persian king has told you to come here and tell everybody, and so there is the real understanding that an unmarried or divorced woman with children has no standing in the culture of the time. So they are literally throwing away a portion of the people who live in Jerusalem and live in Israel. The land connections, and that's important, have been passed down from generation to generation. So that really what they're saying is that all the past rules, all the past purchases, all the past agreements, covenants, if you will, contracts between people in the marriage of these families are now null and void, or you're going to lose everything unless you go to this purity code. And so this really needs to be thought about when we read Ezra, which I'm going to ask you to do. How is that okay? How does a purity code change? How do you decide all of a sudden that if you're not pure, it's unhealthy, it's restrictive, and it's disallowed? And this kind of is exactly what the Nazis did in Germany when they said that if your blood was not pure German blood, there were consequences to that. And instead of it being exactly what Ezra and Nehemiah are saying, that this is for the wholeness and goodness of Judaism, they were saying for the not wholeness and to the detriment of Judaism in that kind of space. So we need to be very aware of that, because that is an overlying piece. And authors have used that purity code in so many levels. I mean, folks maybe have used as their example the Fahrenheit 451 novel. If you're not thinking exactly what we're thinking, if you're not doing exactly what we're saying to do, if you are not following exactly the rules and regulations as they are stipulated in what some folks are considering purity codes, you're out. There's a consequence. You will be, you'll have what you have, and that's a real serious thing to think about. I mean, Fahrenheit 451 is just one of many examples. What we need to be aware of in that play, I think that The Handmaid's Tale gives that same example. Like, these are the rules, and these are only the rules. And there's a purity to that. Then you fall outside the purity, there's a consequence. And so I think that when we look behind that wall, and that's exactly what all these texts do. When you look behind that wall, you see the fact that those who hold those great purity codes are not that pure at all, or anything but pure. And Ezra clearly isn't pure at all. I mean, he ignores the fact that he comes from Babylon. I mean, so he ignores the fact that he's already been enculturated. And he ignores the fact that he's, what we talked about with the Enuma Elish, this sense that there has to be this one and onlyness, and that it's handed down from generation to generation, is super valuable and super important to not to God, because we know that from what we've kind of learned, that's not the case at all. There's mixed relations, and when we think deeply about this, Abraham as an Egyptian wife, Moses. What about Ruth being a Moabite? All these things definitely need to be taken into consideration, that a person's ethnicity and race and cultural background do not define their goodness, their wholeness, and their holiness when it comes to these. So, we can look at these things when we talk about this, and the same holds true for anything in the contemporary 21st century America. What is the thing that makes you a purely an American? I mean, the immigrant experience is the immigrant experience for people, passed down from generation to generation. The peoples of this land are not European and white. They are native to this land, and everybody else is down the road, so we have to keep that in mind. So Nehemiah's text is focused almost exclusively on that. Ezra's text is exclusively focused on. So Nehemiah's text is talking about the physical building of this thing. And so it's interesting that he uses a physicality of it, because he talks about how there has to be like around the clock building and guarding. And there's got to be like, well, why is there building and guarding? And so in the text, it talks about the fact that in the absence of the building and the guarding, people are trying to tear down the walls and tear down the city. And, well, why would they be doing this? And the answer is, quite honestly, folks are tearing it down because they're trying to tear down this sense that there's an in-group and an out-group. And I think it's important that when we put this together, because we're coming down to the end of our study of Hebrew Scripture, or as sometimes referred to as the Old Testament, and move into the New Testament, we see how the religious people have this hierarchy. And then there are so many people that are considered quote unquote sinners, and by sinners, they mean outside of that purity code. They've got family, they've got relatives that they are intermarried to, that are unwelcome at the temple. And so if you're unwelcome at the temple, you're a sinner. So if the temple is the center of what goes on in that community, if the religious folks run really the culture, they run who gets married, who doesn't get married, who gets food, who doesn't get food, who has a relationship with God, who doesn't have a relationship with God. If they have this code that puts you out of that code, there is a rebellion to this, right? And so oftentimes we see, and this is a key to understand, we see that rebellion to the norms and the rules is often considered violent. So there's this author, his name is Paulo Freire, and he talks about the fact that it is the rebellious who are pointed out as being violent, which neglects and negates the reality that the rules by which they're set up to oppress those who rebel are the original position, or the original status, if you will, or state of violence. I mean, Ezra's edict that you can't be married to anyone who's not Jewish And if you don't, there are these consequences where things are taken away from you, or harmed, you're imprisoned, whatever it is. That those strict adherence is a violence against those, and creates an oppression. Therefore, when folks kind of push back against that, they we consider that being the violence, but it is really a violence that was done on them to begin with. So I think it's important to keep all this stuff going on when we read about this. The last thing that I wanted to touch base with you on as we close up here is the fact that the people didn't understand when Nehemiah comes to announce the Torah in Hebrew, and they don't know it anymore, so they have to translate it into Aramaic, right? And so Aramaic is kind of like a Hebrew, but kind of not, kind of a language that the people of that time knew, and so to enculturate the people, they write this thing, the Targum, the small pieces, to do this. But to control them, really, in essence, in a more deeper way. And so, if we take a pause and we think about Ezra and Nehemiah, they really carry out the Persian rule through the Bible, through this text, through this engagement of they're retaking over, recapturing, reconquering, if you will, Jerusalem in the name of Judaism. We know that Nehemiah, as the cultural story goes, was the cupbearer to the king, and so that's why he has such a close relationship to him and is able to go there and do the building. But he's really, I think cupbearer is a really good analogy. If we kind of step back on it, because he's not carrying the cup. Like he's carrying the cup, he's carrying the mantle, he's carrying the rules and regulations, the cupbearer of the king, onto the people who live in Jerusalem at that time. So we want to be aware of the fact that there's pieces to this that are certainly important. And then we read this again, like I said, don't be a page turner, be a reader, take your time. Look at the intricate pieces. What is the story telling you? That's what the cupbearer story is telling you is that really Nehemiah could very well be, if we want to look at this in a very critical way, is more connected to the king of Persia than he is to God. If he really believed in the pristineness, if you will, of his relationship with God, with Yahweh, would he really serve as the king's cupbearer? Would he not go to martyrdom over that? I think it's worth asking that question when we read these texts. I think it's valuably important, because when we read the Bible as literature and we go deep into the conversation about these historic authors, we are reminded that they are telling a story and they are trying to craft a way that we're supposed to live our lives based on these words. And so I think it's valuably important to think to take that into consideration, because if we can read the Bible with a critical lens, does it then invite us to read other things with a critical lens? Why do we not read blogs? Why do we not read with a critical lens? Why do we not read the information given to us by different news outlets with a critical lens? Why do we not watch TV with a critical lens? Why do we not listen to podcasts with a critical lens? That critical lens may come back to us and say, I'm not comfortable with this, but it's right. Or I'm comfortable with this and it's wrong. That creates this sense that when we read things and we read them from a critical perspective, it challenges us on the inside. And that's really what we're supposed to be doing here at higher education, at the college level. Hopefully I'm not telling you something you don't know. This class is about the Bible, and it's not about the Bible simultaneously. It's about thinking about what the words that you've been told in the past, and actually reading those words and actually thinking about what that is and saying, I've got questions, because we're supposed to have questions. Our author of the article that asks all the questions about, Ezra's words and Ezra's take and stuff like that. That's Dr. Fuel. That's the one who, got caught playing kissy tag and was punished to read the Bible, and clearly decided that neither her parents nor the pastor had read that Bible, because they would never have used it as a punishment, because clearly all the stuff that goes on in the first few chapters of Genesis is not something that you would tell someone to read, because it kind of almost supports behaviors that are not in line with the expectations of being a quote unquote good little girl in the 1960s and 70s. So that's why this is such an important process. This is why it's important to read this. You can read it from a spiritual perspective. There's absolutely no doubt about that. You can read it from a religious experience. There's no doubt about it. And you can also read it from a literary experience, which is super important. And you can also read it from a critical experience. And by critical, not just of the text, but critical of ourselves. And that is really the lens by which you move through any text and are changed. Whether you agree with the text or not, it changes you to see things and see yourself in a very different way. So I'm going to post this up. I'm going to post up a video on what we're talking about today. I'll post a quiz up, and hopefully my next attempt will be on Tuesday. I'll send this as through announcements that we'll do a face-to-face kind of conversation next week. We'll work on some kind of Zoom. So keep an eye out for the Zoom. So hey, have a great weekend. I will talk to you soon. All right, take care.